Welcome everyone, wherever you happen to be. I'm Chavat Samuelson. I'm the Director of Jewish Studies. I'm also the Irving and Miriam Lowe Professor of Modern Judaism and Regents Professor of History here at ASU. All of us are fully aware of the horrific events of October 7th, in which Hamas militants launched unprovoked murderous attack on Israeli civilians, destroying 23 settlements that border the Gaza Strip and shelling Israeli population centers with rockets. Violating Israel's sovereignty, Hamas terrorists infiltrated Israel, murdered hundreds of youth who participated in a festival, raped girls and women, slaughtered babies, abducted old men and women, looted homes, and destroyed property. Over 1,300 people were killed, 240 people taken hostage, families were torn apart, and communities were devastated. Israel had no choice but to declare war on Hamas, whose declared goal is to annihilate Israel and all its inhabitants. This is the meaning of the slogan, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." Israel is now facing an existential threat. This morning in the New York Times, in the opinion section, Thomas Friedman explained the threat as follows. Israel's enemies, Hamas, Hezbollah, Islamic militias in Iraq, and the Houthis in Yemen, and now I'm quoting, combine medieval theocratic worldviews with 21st century weaponry. They are no longer organized as small bands of militiamen, but as modern armies with brigades, battalions, cyber capabilities, long-range rockets, drones, and technical support, unquote. Let me remind you that Hamas has used billions of dollars given to them by Arab states and by international relief organizations not to build hospitals, schools, and factories to benefit the Palestinians in Gaza, but to build an elaborate system of underground tunnels in the dense urban population center of Gaza. The tunnels from which the rockets are launched toward Israel each and every day, and you can see the detailed descriptions of those tunnels in today's New York Times. Those tunnels protect only members of Hamas. Since the tunnels are located within and under dense population centers, there is no way to dismantle the military capabilities of Hamas without harming civilians of Gaza, whether they support Hamas or not. The massive loss of life in Gaza has unleashed a new wave of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism all over the world, including in the US and especially on college campuses. The pro-Palestinian and overtly pro-Hamas demonstrations have focused on the suffering of the Palestinians and have been silent on the abominable atrocities of Hamas on October 7th. The demonstrations and their coverage in the media also gloss over the fact that Hamas continues to shell Israel with long-distance rockets, and that over 200,000 Israelis have been evacuated from the settlements around Gaza Strip, as well as from settlements in the northern borders of Israel with Lebanon and Syria. So Israelis have been displaced within their own sovereign state. We are in the midst of a war, not only for the future of Israel, the future of the Palestinian struggle for self-determination, and the future of the Middle East, but also for the future of the Jewish people everywhere in the world. It is no exaggeration to say that the conflict has global implications, since it is already spreading to Europe and to the United States. If Hamas's vision and methods win, the West will lose. Negative emotions and heated passions now dominate the public discourse about the war. But what is missing is knowledge of the history of Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a century-old conflict, and to understand it, we must become familiar with its intricacies that encompass the history of Zionism, the wars between Israel and Arab neighboring states, the refugee problem created by the War of 1948, the use of terror as means of conflict resolution, the settlement movement in the West Bank, and the failed attempts to reach peace in the Middle East. To help us understand the complexity of this situation, the Center for Jewish Studies at ASU put together 3 programs in the past 2 weeks. Our first program featured That was on October 30th, featured Victor Peskin. The focus then was, why have the peace efforts failed so far? The second program was just this past Thursday, and each featured Professor Victor Peskin, Professor Chad Haynes, Mr. Anand Gopal, and me. All of us participated in a roundtable that addressed the question, how can we talk about the war in the Middle East? And we showed that it's doable. This morning, we are fortunate to host Professor Arieh Saposnik from Ben-Gurion University in Israel, who will shed light on the origins of Zionism and the making of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Briefly, let me tell you this about his rich career. He's an associate professor at Ben-Gurion Institute for the Study of Israel and Zionism at Ben-Gurion University of the Negev in Israel. Before joining the faculty of BGU, that's Ben-Gurion University, he held the Roslyn and Arthur Gilbert Foundation Chair in Israel Studies at UCLA, where he was also the founding director of the Eunice and Soraya Nazarian Center for Israel Studies. Several people on this call, myself included, know that before he joined the faculty of UCLA in 2009, Professor Saposnik was here with us at Arizona State University, where he held the Jess Schwartz Chair in Hebrew Culture in the School of International Letters and Cultures, in short, SILC, and where he taught courses on the history of Zionism, the history of Israel, and Israeli society and culture. Professor Saposnik's first book, the title is Becoming Hebrew, The Creation of a Jewish National Culture in Ottoman Palestine, was published in 2008 by Oxford University Press. His second book, Zionism's Redemptions, in plural, Images of the Past and Visions of the Future in Jewish Nationalism, was published by Cambridge University Press in 2021. His current research is about Joseph Klausner, a very interesting, he's an intellectual biography of the historian Joseph Klausner, and he's writing another study with Gideon Katz about the role of philosophical thought and writing in the making of Hebrew culture. So nobody can be better equipped and capable to explain to us the origins of Zionism and the making of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Professor Saposnik, the screen is yours. We're all waiting to listen to you.
Thank you, Chava. And let me say, it really is a special event for me as well to be admittedly virtually back at ASU, but a little bit back at ASU. So it's nice to be back. I'll look forward to finding an opportunity to be there physically as well and actually see everybody. Chava began by bringing what I'm going to be talking about today, which will take us over a century backward in history. But Chava, you connected it to the events of the last month, to the Hamas attack on Israel and to the ongoing war. In fact, as mentioned, I am a faculty member at Ben-Gurion University in the Negev. I live down south. I happen to live in one of the quietest and safest little corners of the country. But just to bring home the ongoing nature of this war, it is not inconceivable that my office, from which I'm speaking to you all, happens to be in our safe room, but the rest of my family may have to join us should the situation require it. Unlikely, but that's where we are. The war is in fact ongoing. The thrust of it in the last 24 hours has moved up north more than down south, actually, although fighting continues in the Gaza Strip as well. A little further down the road, I'll share some maps with you as well. Let me also just point out that again, I'm going to talk about the history. As Chava mentioned, I really believe deeply that in order to gain a greater understanding of what is happening today and in the past month, we really do need some historical perspective, which is painfully lacking in much of the discourse and in much of the reporting as well. I'm a historian of Zionism by and large, and I can tell you that even when I was in the US, which is now over 10 years ago, the very word Zionism was often a taboo on many American university campuses. I think that situation has just grown more extreme. And taboos are not healthy for us. I think we should try and understand what it is we're talking about when we're talking about Zionism, and the way to understand that is through historical perspective. So I'm going to take us back to the very origins of Zionism, look at some of its complications, some of its paradoxes, and some of what it was able to do. In addition, we have a lot of material to cover today because I am also going to try and address the early encounters between Zionism and the Arabs in Palestine, and how what we know today as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict began to evolve. So it is a lot of material to cover. Before I actually launch into our history, two other prefatory comments. One with regard to Zionism itself. And let me say this. First of all, as a historian, my job is to explain change over time. That's what historians do. And the story of Zionism is one that really shouts out for historical explanation in that sense, because if we think about the two main thrusts of Zionism, one of which was the establishment of a Jewish state, right? That's sort of perhaps the most familiar thrust of Zionism. But also if we think about the cultural dimension of Zionism, which if you ask me, and I can elaborate on this later in the Q&A, I actually think it was the main goal of Zionism. Statehood was a means to the end, an indispensable means, but a means. It was cultural revival, and in fact, even as I argue in my book on Zionism's redemptions, a redemptive vision that was the ultimate goal. What's striking about Zionism is that after its birth, even just a little over a century ago, both of those ideas, the idea that there could be a Jewish state in what was then Palestine, and that there could be a Hebrew culture with Hebrew-speaking people walking around the streets, both were preposterous ideas. You really had to be crazy to believe in either of them. When Theodor Herzl publishes his pamphlet, The State of the Jews, Der Judenstaat, in 1896, the people around him tell him, you need a vacation. It was that crazy an idea, certainly in the kinds of surroundings where Theodor Herzl tended to exist. The idea of Hebrew language, okay? Even one of the leading writers who helped to create modern Hebrew style thought at the beginning of the 20th century that spoken Hebrew was a pipe dream. A decade later, he wrote, unbelievable, it's actually happened. So one of the tasks of history is to try and understand how these preposterous, crazy ideas in a very short historical time span actually became very concrete realities. One final prefatory comment, and then I will launch into our history. That explanation really suggests that Zionism, unlike what we will often hear on many university campuses, where Zionism is essentially seen as a synonym for apartheid, imperialism, colonialism, and virtually any derogatory term we can think of, is an unparalleled human achievement, virtually unparalleled. Okay? So let me say a few things then about how I understand what Zionism is about. Oops, hold on. So first of all, let's come to the most glaring paradox of Zionism. Okay? And this is the paradox that, that tells us that on the one hand, it's clear that for centuries and centuries, Jewish culture and Jewish life, wherever Jews lived, whether it was in the Christian world or the Muslim world, was deeply imbued with all sorts of expressions of a deep and intense bond between the Jewish people and the land of Israel. Right? All sorts of customs that we can point to, Jews in Europe facing eastward, the direction of Jerusalem when they pray 3 times a day, the custom of traveling to the Holy Land to be buried there, or being buried with a small satchel of soil from the land of Israel if one couldn't travel there, which was the case for most people. All sorts of customs and traditions that indicate the connection to the land of Israel. Of course, anybody who's ever been to a Passover Seder knows that at the end of the Seder, we say next year in Jerusalem. Okay? Many, many indications of this. However, given all of that, this bond did not bear immediate implications for Jews for all those centuries, at least not immediate implications outside the boundaries of the kinds of customs and traditions that I just spoke about. In other words, the sense when Jews at the end of the Passover Seder said next year in Jerusalem, they did not think that that meant they should pack up their bags and prepare to travel to Jerusalem. Okay? So how do we explain, number one, the fact that it did not mean this to most Jews most of the time, and secondly, the fact that somewhere around the mid to late 19th century, there are growing numbers of Jews who begin to argue that that is what it should mean, that Jews need to organize and return en masse to the land of Israel, as it's known in Jewish tradition, and to reestablish Jewish culture, reestablish Jewish sovereignty in that land. Okay? That is a mid to late 19th century phenomenon, and we need to understand why that appears at that time. Okay? We have here expressions then of the land of Israel here, right? The traditional promise, the biblical promise, right? The connection goes back to the biblical text in all sorts of expressions throughout the biblical text. This is a depiction, of course, of the covenant between God and Abraham, which is the earliest iteration of that bond, and the modern version, of course, with Theodor Herzl at the First Zionist Congress in 1897. Okay, so a few central points. As I mentioned then, an active movement for a Jewish return to Palestine emerges only around the mid-19th century, as I said before, and we need to understand why. One classical or common answer to that question that is often given has been the rise of modern exclusivist and racial anti-Semitism. I want to suggest that that is, of course, an important factor in helping to explain the rise of modern Zionism, but in my view, it's far from sufficient. And what we really need to have, to understand, in order to understand how Zionism emerges in the mid to late 19th century, is to understand the radical shift in Jewish self-perception that comes about in those years. And it's really that radical change in Jewish self-perception that helps us understand the rise of Zionism, by the way, before the most extreme manifestations of modern political anti-Semitism. So to understand that that change in self-perception, I want to go back to the traditional notion of exile. Okay? What does the term exile mean? Now, exile, of course, or in Hebrew, what we call galut, is in the Zionist lexicon probably one of the dirtiest words, right? To be galut is the most negative. Anything that is galuti, exilic, is traditionally seen as very negative. But exile is not a term invented by modern Zionism. Exile is a term that follows Jewish culture from its very inception. And we can talk about the twin poles of exile and redemption. And Jewish messianic traditions are all about those twin poles, right? We are currently in exile, as we say in daily prayers, right? Because of our sins, we were exiled from our land, and we anticipate the coming of the Messiah. The coming of the Messiah should correct both the geographical error of the Jews being outside of their land, but in various Jewish traditions, it is understood to correct much more than that, including sort of a cosmic error, and one might even say cosmic exile. Okay? We can talk about two fundamental tensions within modern Zionism. One is in its relationship to Jewish messianism. On the one hand, it takes a great deal from traditional Jewish messianism, including, most obviously, even its name, right? The longing for Zion is The term Zion, of course, Zion is a mountain, a hill in Jerusalem. By extension, it's a term that refers to Jerusalem as a whole, and by further extension, to the land of Israel. And so this longing for Zion is something that is embedded in traditional Jewish Messianism, and this is one of the obvious elements that modern Zionism takes from traditional Jewish Messianic traditions. On the other hand, Zionism in many ways rejects traditional Jewish Messianism, including, and perhaps most particularly, what it regards as a Messianic passivism, not pacifism, but a passivism, the notion that the job of a good Jew is to live according to the mitzvot, according to the commandments, and to wait for God to bring about redemption. Zionism, by and large, rejects that notion and demands human action to bring about its vision of redemption. That's one tension. So we have drawing from traditional Jewish messianisms, and yet at the same time also rejecting them. A second tension I want to point to is the tension within Zionism, and in a certain sense we can say this is true of Jewish thought more broadly, between the mythical land of Israel, what we can in a certain sense in Hebrew we would call it Eretz Yisrael shel Mala, Yerushalayim shel Mala, the sort of metaphorical, spiritualized version, and the actual land of Israel of rocks and stones that people began immigrating to in the late 19th century. Okay, so these are some foundational tensions that Zionism is going to be grappling with throughout its history. Fundamentally, I want to argue that we need to understand Zionism then as a movement striving for various kinds of what I like to call secularized redemptions in dialogue with Jewish redemptive traditions, Christian notions of salvation, and secular political messianisms. Okay. So how do we get there? So now, forgive me, I'm taking us all a few centuries back. This is a rough diagram of what the medieval political social structure in Europe looked like. We can see right up at the top, we have the Pope or the church, just below the monarch, and all the way down to the peasants and the serfs at the bottom of the pyramid. Now, we might ask, where in this diagram do the Jews belong? And the answer is that they don't really fully belong in this diagram at all. In a certain sense, we can say, I hope you can see my cursor, we can say they have some overlap here with the merchant class. One of the roles that Jews tended to play in medieval Europe was that of merchants, often international merchants, and as moneylenders. But overall, they have their own little bubble outside of this structure. Jews spoke a different language, Yiddish by and large. They dressed differently. They had their own rather closed communities, lived amongst themselves, were subject to particular laws that allowed them in certain numbers to live in a certain place. Really a class of their own in this sense. Okay? And this wasn't terribly surprising in the medieval pyramid structure that we see here, because in fact, in each of these little bricks here of the pyramid, we have an almost self-contained class with its economy, with its customs and so forth, right? So it didn't really matter that Jews didn't speak the same language as, say, the peasants they were living near, because in fact, the nobles and the monarchs didn't speak the same language as the peasants and the serfs either, and nobody thought that there was anything strange about that. Right? With the advent of the modern economy, modern industrialization, urbanization, these expectations are going to begin to change. Right? By the time, and I'm going to zip a few centuries ahead here, by the time we hit the 19th century, we have a number of factors coming together. Number one, we have a growing interest in what is then called the Orient in Europe in the 19th century. And when Europeans spoke about the Orient in the 19th century, they by and large meant what we would today call the Near East or the Middle East. Less so, they were less focused on the Far East. We might include India in this as well, certainly in the British context. but the Orient often referred to the Near East. And we can see this, by the way, in one manifestation of this interest, and that is the popularity of Orientalist art. Every self-respecting bourgeois home in 19th century Europe had a piece of Orientalist art hanging on its wall. These were largely paintings from Lebanon, Egypt, the Holy Land. These were the focal points of interest in the Orient. And this growing interest in the Orient, and I could talk about where this came from maybe later on in Q&A if people are interested. Oops, excuse me. This growing interest in the Orient helped to rekindle a certain Jewish interest in the Orient as well. We also have a growing prominence in some Christian churches in Europe of what is known as restorationist theologies. These are theological approaches which see a restoration of the Jews to the Holy Land as part of the fulfillment of prophecy, right? This is in contrast with what we would call replacement theologies, which hold that the church essentially has replaced the Jews who no longer have a role to play in redemptive history. Okay? The 19th century sees the growth of restorationist theologies, not accidentally, by the way, very prominently in the Anglican Church, in certain sectors of the Anglican Church, and that will help explain some of Britain's interest in Zionism and in the Jewish presence in the land of Israel a little bit further down the road. We also have, as a part of this, a changing status of the Holy Land itself, with the decline of the Ottoman Empire and its power, and competing European powers now grappling for pieces of the Holy Land. Finally, we need to add to this a profound crisis of Jewish life in the diaspora and in the small Jewish community in the land of Israel as well. Right? Jewish life, by the time we hit the mid-19th century, is in profound crisis, and I'll talk a little bit more about why that's the case in just a minute. Let me just point out that these combine with a number of additional factors: the advent of the Enlightenment movement, Enlightenment philosophy beginning in the late 18th century, really, the notion that all men are created equal, right? As the American Declaration of Independence puts it, right? Based on Enlightenment philosophy. If all men are created equal, then these differences are not fundamental. They're not inherent. They are products of socialization. Okay? One impact of this is a move over the course of the 19th century toward emancipation of the Jews. In other words, the granting of equal rights to Jews throughout European states. The first place where this happens is in post-revolutionary France, right? We have the French Revolution in 1789, and for 2 years, the French Parliament will debate, well, what about the Jews? Now that everybody is no longer a subject to the king, but rather a citizen of the French state, what about the Jews? And in 1791, the French Parliament decides that this includes the Jews as well. So this is an unprecedented reality for Jews. Now they are being essentially told by the state, you are equal citizens. This is an opportunity that Jews before had not dreamt of. It is also a challenge to identity, because if now I am nationally a Frenchman, or nationally a German, or nationally whatever I might be, what is it that makes me Jewish at this point? And all sorts of ideas and movements will now emerge with various answers to what is it that should be maintained, if anything at all. Some argue that little should be maintained of Jewish tradition or Jewish identity. Okay? So this is one, so emancipation on the one hand is an unprecedented opportunity. On the other hand, it's one of the major reasons for a crisis of identity that Jews now enter in the 19th century. Within this crisis of identity, we need to add the growth of European nationalisms, and European nationalism interacts with these other phenomena in a number of different ways, in both a pull and a push, right? So let me describe what I mean by that. The push is very clearly demonstrated by the biography of Theodor Herzl, for example, right? Theodor Herzl, when he is a young student at the university, is a member of a German nationalist fraternity. In other words, he sees himself as a member of the German nation and shares in the strivings and interests of German nationhood. At the time, there's not yet a German state, we should recall. And one of the main goals, of course, is to establish such a state. But by the end of his university career, Theodor Herzl will leave that German nationalist fraternity as German nationalism becomes increasingly exclusivist, and particularly exclusivist with regard to the Jews. In other words, German nationalism will increasingly reject the notion that I mentioned that arose in the French Parliament in 1891, the notion that, yes, Jews can be a member of the French nation. German nationalism will increasingly exclude the Jews. Herzl will see himself as excluded from German nationalism. He will leave that fraternity and he will start upon a journey looking for other answers to his Jewishness. That search will ultimately lead him to essentially invent modern political Zionism. And let's add a final element into this mix. I mentioned earlier that modern anti-Semitism is not a sufficient explanation for the rise of Zionism, but it certainly is an important component in this broader explanatory framework. We cannot discount modern racial anti-Semitism. You can see some examples of it here. We are witnessing, in a certain sense, a resurgence, I would argue, of classical anti-Semitic imagery and tropes and ideas and accusations. In fact, let me digress just for a minute and connect to Chava's opening remarks and say that for a number of years now, there's been all sorts of writing and discussion about what has been called the new anti-Semitism and questions regarding its newness. How new is it? What is its connection to older forms of anti-Semitism? One of the striking things that I think has happened in the last 4 weeks is a sense that we're just seeing a resurgence of a kind of 1930s anti-Semitism. There's nothing new about it. It's really a kind of classical anti-Semitism rearing its head once again. We can come back to that a little bit further down. Let me then, okay, so now we have the makings of modern Zionism. One final comment I meant to mention about nationalism. So nationalism has this push factor, right, in Theodor Herzl's case that I mentioned, right? I can't be a member of the German nation, so I need to look for another national belongingness. But nationalism also provides a new kind of language with which many Jews begin to think of themselves. And that's also an important component to understanding much of the language of Zionism. Okay, so let me try and bring together some of the central tenets. So we have a confluence of Jewish messianic traditions, modern nationalism, and a set of prescriptions conceived as remedies for what is by the mid-19th century being called the Jewish problem. Okay, and the Jewish problem, by the way, I should add, has at least 2 different forms. There's the, let's call it the external version, right, which is states such as the French Parliament for those 2 years debating, okay, here's this group that's really kind of separate. They speak their own language, they do their own thing. What do we do with that? What do we do with this group? We can't tolerate, quote, a state within the state. Can we integrate them? If not, what does that mean? So that's the Jewish problem from the outside. The Jewish problem from the inside is related to this crisis of identity and culture that I had mentioned before, this sense that, well, what does it mean to be Jewish today? If we had gone to, if we think about that medieval pyramid that I showed you earlier, and we go to a Jew living in 14th century Europe, and we ask that person, what is it that makes you Jewish? That person would probably look at us with a puzzled look and not even understand the question, because it's everything that makes that person Jewish. It's the language they speak, the food they eat, the clothing they wear, the place they, everything. By the mid-19th century, that person's descendants are all asking themselves the question, well, what is it that makes me Jewish now? And there are different possible answers to that, right? We could give the answer that Judaism is a religion, a faith like Lutheranism, for example. And early Reform Judaism, for example, gives that answer. There are a number of different possibilities. The answer that Zionism gives is that Jews are most fundamentally, they may be all sorts of things, but most fundamentally, Jews are a nation, according to Zionism. Okay? Not a religious group, not a social class. Right? Jews are fundamentally, according to Zionism and religion. This is true, by the way, of religious Zionism as well. Okay? So religious Zionism, of course, sees Jews as a religious nation, but fundamentally as a nation. Okay? The Jewish problem then is perceived as a result of Jewish abnormality. They are a nation, but a nation lacking in some fundamental attributes of nationality. Okay? One of the earliest writings to express this notion is an 1882 pamphlet by a Russian intellectual by the name of Leo Pinsker, who calls for Jewish auto-emancipation. The notion that emancipation, being granted equal rights by the state, is insufficient. First of all, because those are rights granted to Jews as individuals rather than as a collective. And secondly, because we need to be able to emancipate ourselves. Pinsker diagnoses what he calls Judeophobia as a chronic disease, and he writes, and you can see the quote at the bottom of this slide, "Among the living nations of the earth, the Jews occupy the position of a nation long since dead." Right? And Judeophobia, he explains, is fear of the Jewish ghost. So if Jews are akin to living in a ghost-like condition, according to Pinsker, the task is to bring them back to full life. How do you bring a ghost back to full life? You provide the ghost with a body. Right? That body, for Pinsker, is a territory. Okay, so what the Jews lack then is a healthy nationhood rooted in their own national territory. It's important to realize in this context as well, and I won't get into this in any great depth, but it's worth noting that there was a tension within early Zionism between those who held that any territory might do, okay, and there were all sorts of territorial ideas. Both Pinsker and Herzl raised the possibility of Argentina, for example, where there were already a number of Jewish agricultural colonies, but all sorts of ideas. There's virtually no spot on earth that somebody didn't think of as a possible territory for Jewish statehood. Within Zionism, however, that tension is resolved when the Zionist organization essentially takes a decision that only the land of Israel can be the focal point of resources and efforts on the part of that organization, of the Zionist organization. Okay. Now we can talk about a few different Zionisms by that point. We can talk about political Zionism. This is Theodor Herzl's creation in 1897 when he convenes the first Zionist Congress. We can talk about cultural Zionism, which in fact exists before, at least a decade and a half before, the notion that what Jews need is a revival of Jewish culture with a center in the land of Israel. The most familiar figure in this regard is a guy by the name of Echad Ha'am. Some people may have heard of him. Asher Ginsburg was his real name. There was practical Zionism, the notion that we need to simply immigrate to Palestine and start working the land. Labor Zionism, which adopted much of that idea, but added a sort of worker and sometimes socialist color to that. Religious Zionism, which I mentioned before, which stresses the importance of the religious aspect of the nation and of religious practices within Zionism. And a little bit later, we have revisionist Zionism, which is at least ostensibly, by the way, the precursor to the Likud party, the ruling party today in Israel. Many would argue, myself included, that in fact Likud today has nothing to do with revisionist Zionism in terms of what they actually propose for Israeli policy. But technically, this is the ancestor of the Likud party. We could talk about other nuances within that, but let me talk about a little bit about what Zionism then actually does. Okay. I mentioned Theodor Herzl's convening of the First Zionist Congress. Again, the truth is that this is a slightly artificial point at which to begin the history of Zionism, which really begins at least a decade and a half earlier with the advent of something called Chibat Zion, the love of Zion. Leo Pinsker, whom I mentioned before, becomes one of the leaders of Chibat Zion. His pamphlet, Auto-Emancipation, as I mentioned, appears about a decade and a half before Theodor Herzl. In fact, Herzl is known to have remarked in his diary that had he known about the existence of Pinsker's pamphlet, he might not have written Der Judenstaat. But fortunately for the history of Zionism, he didn't know about Pinsker's pamphlet. But 1897 is nevertheless an important turning point. It really is the beginnings of a modern Zionist politics, as well as the establishment of a range of Zionist institutions, including the Zionist Bank, which Herzl established in order to help raise funds to support his Zionist efforts, the Jewish National Fund to purchase lands, and the Congress itself. You can see the rather poor photo of it here on the bottom left of the screen, which really was designed quite self-consciously and purposely as a parliament in the making. Okay, so one of the things that Herzl was able to do is not only raise the idea and propose a plan for how to create a Jewish state, but actually to establish the institutions that would ultimately become the infrastructure of that state. I mentioned probably among the categories that I mentioned, maybe the most important of the divisions, political Zionism versus cultural Zionism. Herzl sees Zionism mostly as a solution to the problem of the Jews, and hence his pamphlet, his famous pamphlet, notice, is titled Der Judenstaat, which is sometimes translated into English as the Jewish state, but that is in fact a mistranslation. It is the state of the Jews. He's interested in physical, political, economic emancipation of the Jews. Achad Ha'am, Asher Ginsburg, is really interested in Zionism as a solution to the problem of Judaism, to the problem, the cultural, spiritual, mental problem facing the modern Jew. Okay, so two very, very different currents. One of the things we can say in a sort of nutshell is that notwithstanding the tensions between these currents, and certainly the personal tensions between Theodor Herzl and Achad Ha'am, who profoundly disliked one another and profoundly disliked each other's worldviews, in the actual practice of how Zionism was ultimately implemented and came about, we see, in a sense, a fusion of the two. Zionist diplomacy becoming key, and at the same time, the establishment of cultural institutions, such as an art institution, a music institution, a university in 1925, as being crucial to the creation of a modern Jewish society and modern Jewish culture in what was then Palestine. The fundamental shared motif, I want to argue, and I think this is really important in understanding Zionism, and in this sense, Zionism is more than simply a Jewish national movement. The fundamental shared motif in virtually all of these is really, excuse me, let me go back there, is really a sense of the undoing of exile, and in many, many cases, I would say most cases of Zionism, some version of a redemptive vision. Okay? We can see that in this kind of recurring visual that we see in Zionist art. Okay? This is a postcard from the Fifth Zionist Congress in 1903, and this kind of motif is going to repeat itself. You can see, in this case, the quintessential exile, right? This is the exile of Egypt with the downtrodden exilic Jew wrapped in some kind of combination of barbed wire and thorns here, right? On the left. Exile is always on the left. And on the right-hand side, we can see the sun rising in the east with the Hebrew word Zion written on it, Zion. that's where redemption lies. Okay, and this motif will repeat itself. Okay, once again, this is a postcard from the first Zionist Congress, right? We can see, this is interesting, by the way, and I can expand on this if we have time. Here we have exile on the left, but notice that this is, in this case, exile is actually symbolized by the Western Wall, which was a point of some ambivalence in a great deal of Zionist thought. And on the right-hand side, we see a Jewish farmer sowing seeds in the land reborn. Right? And once again, that motif repeats itself here. Again, downtrodden, mournful, wailing Jews by what was then known as the Wailing Wall, right? With the sun rising in the east on the right-hand side and Jewish farmers sowing seeds and tending to the lands. Okay? So we always have this dichotomy between exile on the left, redemption on the right. What do Zionists do with these ideas? And so what are the focal points of Zionist activity, of Zionist praxis between 1881, which is when we can say is the birth of Chibat Zion, the precursor to political Zionism, and 1948, the establishment of the state? Well, one prerequisite to anything, of course, for Zionism to happen was immigration. Most of the Jews of the world did not live in Palestine at the time. In order to establish a Jewish state there, in order to create a Hebrew culture there, Jews would have to move. Right? Now, we should recall that in a certain sense, regardless of Zionism itself, in the wake of the pogroms that had erupted in the Russian Empire in 1881-82, which is part of the backdrop to the birth of Chibat Zion, of the love of Zion, immigration was on the agenda for Eastern European Jews in general, right? Between 1881 and 1914, the outbreak of the First World War, about 2.5 million Jews left the Russian Empire, the vast majority of them for North America, of course, but others for other places, including small but committed numbers of Zionists who began to immigrate to Palestine. Right? So immigration was key. In addition to immigration, of course, they had to embark on settlement. How do we provide income, food, housing for the people who are immigrating? And how do we transform them from the exilic Jew, quote unquote, who was an object of a fair amount of criticism for being, among other things, detached from the land, and reconnect Jews to the land? Right? So settlement, and agricultural settlement in particular, became an important focal point for a great deal of Zionist activity. Diplomacy. In order to not only immigrate and settle the land, but actually to get what Herzl had called a charter for Palestine, right? An international or imperial permit to come there and establish a society, to immigrate en masse, and hopefully statehood. Diplomacy was another key focus, and cultural renaissance and the creation of modern Hebrew language and modern Hebrew culture. Okay? And here, I mentioned briefly earlier, a range of cultural institutions of various kinds that were designed to create a Hebrew public space, schools, virtually anything one can think of. If one can go into the library of the institute that I work in and find volumes from the 1930s about the revival of Hebrew seamanship, the revival of Hebrew everything. Okay? So the idea was everything needed to be revived and Hebraicized, in a sense, okay? Including the Jews themselves. Okay? So one of the tasks was to make a new Jew and to shape a new Hebrew culture. And this was so thoroughgoing, the expectation here, and this is what these images try to stress, is that the Jew's body itself was to be reshaped and, in a sense, reclaimed. The prevailing imagery of Jews in the 19th and 20th century in Europe was one in which Jews were seen, of course, as weak, as old. Even young Jews were old. Effeminate. Jewish men were considered to be effeminate, right? And so one of the tests was to regenerate a vibrant, strong, youthful Hebrew culture. And so athletics and physical activity became an important focal point as well. And we can see various versions of the notion of the new Jew. There were many different versions of the new Jew. One of the things, and let me just stress this, is that we find it, among other things, also hearkening back to ancient imagery, right? So here we have this, of course, reminiscent of the biblical spies, the two who return and tell the children of Israel that when they're in the desert, right after leaving Egypt, that it's a land of milk and honey, and the pioneers see themselves in this kind of a light. Okay? Now, I've been talking a fair amount now about Zionist history, and I promised you to talk somewhat about the makings of the conflict as well. So let me begin to move into there. I'll spend a few minutes on this, and then I'll open this up to Q&A in order to allow all your interest to be expressed as well. In the context of this making of the new Jew, one of the kinds of images that we find is this notion of Jews as Orientals themselves. Yeah, I mentioned earlier in the talk that there was a growing interest in Europe in general in the Orient, and there was an association between Jews and the Orient as well. Jews were seen, in fact, one of the common terms by which Jews were referred to in 19th century Europe was the half-Asians. Okay? They're kind of Europeans, but really they're Asians. They really belong over there in the Orient. And this was internalized and accepted by many Jews, and to a very significant extent within Zionism as well, right? So Zionism, we should say, has at least two main currents in this regard. On the one hand, there's a very famous quote by Theodor Herzl when he writes it in a number of places in various versions. It's in the Jewish state, it's in his correspondence with the German Kaiser. He says, Zionism will allow the Jews to be a European bulwark against what he calls Asiatic barbarism, right? So the notion that what Zionism is about bringing the West into the East and being an outpost of the West in the East. Okay? This is a very familiar aspect of Zionism. What's less familiar, but was no less prominent at the time, certainly in the early years of Zionism, was an opposite notion. We need to remember that most of the Jews who were leaving Europe to immigrate to Palestine were leaving Europe fairly traumatized, victims of pogroms, victims of persecution, with a profound sense that Europe was rejecting them. And many of them simply said, you know what, Europe, you tell us we're not Europeans. You're right. We are, in fact, Orientals, and we are returning to the Orient to merge once again, in the language of the time, with our racial brethren, okay? Fully expecting that that merger with the racial brethren will be a happy family reunion. Okay? And we can see here, this is an image, for example, from the early 20th century. These may look like Bedouin horse riders, but in fact, this is a group known at the time as Hashomer. This was one of the early Zionist self-defense organizations. These are people who probably got off the boat from Russia, somewhere between 5 minutes and 6 months before this. And we can see this romanticized image of trying to take on the Orientalness that they believed they, in fact, belonged to. Okay? And there's another image of that. Okay, so where, of course, was all of this taking place? I remind us briefly, this is the Ottoman Empire in various fluxes of it. It grows and contracts at various times, but for our purposes at the moment, what we need to know is that what was then called Palestine in the 19th and 20th and early 20th century was a part of a broader expanse of the Ottoman Empire generally, and that is the context into which, up until 1918, Jewish immigrants were immigrating into the Ottoman Empire, into a Palestine that was part of a broader, largely Muslim expanse. Okay? At the same time, Palestine was divided into various governorships and, let's say, the equivalent of what we would call in the US counties. Okay? So various districts. It was not a single unit, not a single political unit in this sense, and that also had its impact on the lives of Arabs and Jews in Palestine at the time. Okay? By 1914, by the outbreak of the First World War, following what are known as the first and the second Aliyah, right? Aliyah is the term we use for the waves of immigration to Israel, to what is then Palestine. We can see that those two waves are already changing the landscape of the land. Okay? We can see all these little stars here are new Jewish colonies, largely agricultural colonies, but also the urban population, the urban Jewish population is growing significantly in Jerusalem, in Yaffo, so much so that Yaffo will expand and there will be a small neighborhood of Yaffo built to the north, which will be called Tel Aviv, and you know what will happen with that small neighborhood. So the landscape and the population are changing. I'm skipping ahead here. How am I doing on time? They don't look better when somebody writes.
Yeah, time is of the essence. So
how am I doing, Chava? Tell me.
Why don't you try to finish within kind of 10 minutes?
Okay. In fact, I'll try to do 5.
5. Good.
And then we'll leave time for Q&A. Okay. So I mentioned Zionist diplomacy as one of the key avenues of activity. In 1917, on November 2nd of 1917, 2 of the leading Zionist diplomats, Chaim Weizmann and Nachum Sokolov, are successful in establishing what is unquestionably Zionism's greatest achievement up until that time, and that is what we know as the Balfour Declaration. The Declaration is a very short text that is full of ambiguity that will be the cause of much fighting between Zionists and British authorities, between Zionists and Arabs, between Arabs and British authorities, to this day. Okay? However, we don't have time to get into the complexities and ambiguities of the Balfour Declaration. For current purposes, let me just say that essentially it was such a great achievement because really it was the charter that Herzl had been aiming for during his years as the Zionist leader. Herzl had died in 1904, so he wasn't around to see the Balfour Declaration, but essentially this is the greatest empire in the world at the time, the empire on which the sun never sets, right? Recognizing the Zionist organization, recognizing the Jewish right to what it calls a national home in Palestine. Okay, so a tremendous Zionist achievement. For Palestinians, considered an abominable document to this day. We can come back to why that's the case, what it does and does not say. Okay? So World War I ends. General Allenby in December of 1917 marches into Jerusalem, and Britain now occupies Palestine. Britain is now granted a mandate for Palestine by the League of Nations. The mandate for Palestine initially includes this orangish area here, okay? In other words, it includes what we would today call Israel and the Palestinian territories and the Kingdom of Jordan, okay? That will be the case only up until 1922, when what's known as the Churchill White Paper will essentially cut off everything east of the Jordan River, establishing the semi-independent Kingdom of Jordan and making what we can call Western Palestine now the site of British mandate. Okay. Skipping a few years ahead once again, before I skip here, let me just say, so by the 1920s, we have an increasingly established Zionist presence in Palestine, and we're also beginning to see the birth of a Palestinian national movement. Okay? Which is the 1920s is really the moment when it begins to come comes to life, and perhaps the moment of quickening really is 1929, in the 1929 riots, which begin, not surprisingly, of course, at the Temple Mount Western Wall area and spread throughout the country. This is the first outbreak of countrywide violence between Arabs and Jews, and broadly considered the moment of quickening of Palestinian Arab nationalism. By 1936, there will be what's known as the Great Revolt. The Palestinians will revolt against Zionism, which has now been further reinforced with another wave of immigration coming, especially from Germany, right? This is after the rise of Nazism in Germany. And so the Great Arab Revolt will revolt against Zionism and against British mandate. In response to that, the British will send a commission known as the Peel Commission, which for the first time will put on the international table the idea of partitioning Palestine into three, really. An Arab state here in the yellowish, a Jewish state, a rather small Jewish state in this whatever color that is, pink, and two areas with holy sites, mostly Christian holy sites, which will be international sites. Okay? The Peel Commission will be quickly removed from the table. It falls out of favor with the British. The Arabs reject it out of hand, and the Zionists rather ambivalently accept it as a basis for negotiation. In the meantime, we have a small thing known as World War II and the Holocaust. In 1947, the UN once again, now the UN convenes to discuss the Palestine problem. And on November 29th of 1947, votes to partition Palestine into a Jewish state, slightly expanded from what the Peel Commission had expected. These are the orange portions, an Arab state, the yellow portions, and a smaller international area around Jerusalem. I should have given you a map. I did give you a map in my next slide. Okay, May 14th of 1948. The Declaration of Israeli Independence. I won't pause on that in any great to any great extent. Oops. Independent Israel is larger than what the UN proposal had proposed in the wake of the 1948 war, which is really the 1947 to 1949 war. And post-1949 Israel is this area here with the green, which we will then call the West Bank, and the blue, which is the Gaza Strip. Okay, so this is, that will change in 1967 when Israel will occupy the entire Sinai Peninsula, as well as the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, or Judea and Samaria, as it is sometimes known, and the Golan Heights. We can, for our current purposes, ignore the Sinai Peninsula, which was returned to Egypt under the peace treaty with them. The current focus of Israeli-Palestinian conflict has to do really with the fate of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, although perhaps beyond that as well, depending on whom one asks. Maybe I'll skip over the various territorial divisions in the Oslo Agreement leading up to where we are today. We can leave that for Q&A. Why don't I end my share here and open up for Q&A? Before I end my share, I'm sorry, one last thing I do have to do here is to bring us to this final slide. Okay. Since I was arguing that Zionism is really more than a Jewish nationalism, but really a redemptive movement, very quickly to show you some of what David Ben-Gurion, person in whose university I work, but also really the founder of the state for all intents and purposes, writes the following: the goal of the return to Zion was that the Jews will come to complete political and spiritual redemption. The miracle that has taken place in our generation, he writes, is that the vehicle has been created for the fulfillment of the redemptive vision. Notice the state for him is a vehicle, an indispensable vehicle. This is the man perhaps most closely associated with the establishment of the state. The state is a vehicle. The goal is the fulfillment of the redemptive vision. What is that redemptive vision? Israel's task, he writes, is to work toward a day when all nations will be free internally and externally. Israel, he believed, was obligated to express loyalty to the age-old Jewish vision of national and human redemption, and the one way to be sure that the rise of the new world will bring, that is the one way to be sure, that the new world will bring Israel as well, peace, security, and international dignity. And let me just end, it was important for me to end with that in order to stress that the relegation and so much of academic discourse and discourse on college campuses of Zionism to the world of racism, apartheid, colonialism, and imperialism is not only wrong, it is profoundly wrong and a historical injustice that, in my view, in trying to understand some of what's happening today, that is a crucial point that needs to be corrected in making sense of the discourse of the current war as well.
Great, thank you so much. This was excellent. Let's look at the Q&A, and since I see we have 6 questions already, can you handle them directly? Can you see the
On my screen, just game with me for a moment, so let me get there. Yeah.
Okay, so I allow you, you can take care of it, yeah.
Yes. Okay, so I see the first question is, with diplomacy, whom did they ask for a permit to establish a state? Yeah, that's an excellent question. It varied. Okay, so in Herzl's day, Herzl was really the first Zionist diplomat. And in his day, the primary target for his diplomacy was the Ottoman Sultan. His main goal was to obtain what he called a charter for Palestine from the Sultan, because it was the Sultan who ruled Palestine. He thought that he could convince the Sultan. He played on the stereotype of Jews and money, and tried to get the Sultan, and the Ottoman Empire at the time was in deep, deep debt. And he said, I will gather the wealthy Jews of the world to cover the Ottoman debt, essentially, in return for a charter for Palestine. Of course, the Ottoman Sultan understood that Herzl was bluffing, because the wealthy Jews were not behind him. They were not supporters of Herzl's Zionism, and they were not interested in any case. So later, Herzl turned to the German Kaiser, who was an ally of the Ottoman Sultan, and tried to persuade him to put pressure on the Sultan. He turned to the British, he turned to the Pope. He turned to anybody whom he thought could help to put this. In fact, he even turned to, in the wake of the Kishinev pogrom in 1903, this was a deeply traumatic, extremely violent pogrom, certainly by the standards of that time. Today it would be on the back pages of the newspaper, because we've become so inured to violence. But at the time it was deeply traumatic. And Herzl controversially went to Pleve, the internal minister of the Russian Empire at the time, under the assumption, Herzl assumed, that this deeply anti-Semitic government in the Russian Empire had a shared interest with him, right? They wanted the Jews out, and so do I, Theodor Herzl, want the Jews out. I want them in Palestine, and so maybe we can join forces. Later, after Herzl's day, Zionist diplomacy continued to turn essentially to whomever might listen to them. Most notably, of course, worked with the British and with the Americans. One of the things that Ben-Gurion was very astute in understanding was that the United States was going to be the next world power after Britain, and he really turned Zionist attention to the US to a large extent. Okay, next question. In the Ottoman Empire, people could freely travel throughout their lands. Why were Ottoman Jews not moving en masse to Palestine? Was the idea that they should, peculiarly European? Yeah, okay, excellent question. Yes, Zionism is a European phenomenon in its early days. It really is a response to either the problem of the Jews in Herzl's version, or the problem of Judaism in Ahad Ha'am's version. And those problems were fundamentally, in the early stages, European problems. However, that being said, it did not take very long for Zionist ideas to migrate to other parts of the Jewish world, to the Ottoman Empire, to in general spread throughout the Muslim world as well. It took different forms, but Zionism became an increasingly powerful force within Ottoman Jewry as well. that would increase, of course, even further as Zionism sort of advanced and continued to build in Palestine, and then even more so, of course, after 1948, when Jews in many parts of what had been the Ottoman Empire, when now the Middle East, as we would call it, Jews now faced persecution, which was intensifying in response to the escalating Israeli-Palestinian conflict, right? So there's the famous case of the Farhud in Iraq, right? This was an anti-Jewish pogrom, and in various places throughout the Arab world, Jews were increasingly threatened, and that then led to mass immigration in the 1950s and into the 1960s from the Muslim world to Israel. Okay, I see there's a lot of questions. I'll try to be a little bit briefer here. How are we on time, Chava? Tell me if you need to
go
cut
ahead.
me.
We can definitely go until 11:30 our time. So you have 20 minutes. Let's try to get it to cover most of it.
Okay, so let me see here. No doubt multiple factors were causes of the rise of Zionism, from Enlightenment ideas to nationalism to emancipation. But the relative diminishment of what strikes me as a necessary, though maybe not sufficient one, is anti-Semitism, both in the 18th and 19th century and well into the 20th. My question is why this marginalization of this factor, which reveals itself horribly in our moment? Yeah, that is a fair question. And maybe I overstated my case and I didn't quite mean to do that. I in a sense, my presentation of Zionism is a response to the widespread notion that really we can almost entirely explain Zionism as a response to anti-Semitism. And I think that's mistaken. I think Zionism was so rich. Okay? In fact, I'll say, if there are students of nationalism out there, you know, in the study of nationalism, the one book that everybody always needs to quote, and usually misquotes, is Benedict Anderson's Imagined Communities. And one of the things Anderson writes in his introduction to the book is he talks about the three paradoxes of nationalism. And one of his three paradoxes is he points to the tremendous political power of nationalism as opposed to its philosophical and intellectual poverty. And I have to say, first of all, I think that's not a terribly convincing paradox to me with regard to nationalism in general, but that could, I think, never be written by a student of Zionism. Chava mentioned in her introduction that I'm working on a project that looks at the ways in which philosophical thought was conceived as an integral part of the national revival by at least some people. There is so much writing and so much interesting and philosophical writing in the history of Zionism, and it's all about how do we recreate Jewish culture in the conditions of the modern world? What do we take from the past? What do we reject from the past? And so in that sense, that is the sense in which I try and stress that Zionism is not exclusively a reaction to anti-Semitism. It's a very rich, vibrant attempt to create culture. Of course, however, and I fully accept the qualification that you placed here in your question, of course, we need to add anti-Semitism in the mix, which was a major push factor. In fact, let me add one other. I said I'd be brief, but you know that's never the case. So I have to add, you know, in many ways, I think we are now living, and this is related to your question, David. We're living in what I've called already in a number of conversations, an 1880s moment. And what do I mean by that? What really led to the birth of Chibat Zion, this love of Zion, the precursor to modern Zionism, was not so much the wave of pogroms that swept through the Russian Empire itself. That was an important factor, of course. But what really led to it was the fact that Jewish intellectuals, many of whom had been proponents of what was then called Russification, right, accepting, increasingly integrating into Russian society, were waiting for the response of Russian intellectuals, of Tolstoy to condemn the pogroms, of the revolutionary socialists to condemn the pogroms, and it never came. And in fact, many of the revolutionaries celebrated the pogroms because they were seen as, you know, the masses are rising up, and that's a good thing, and so we don't want to alienate them and condemn the pogroms. And I think that is the experience of many Jews, both in Israel and abroad at this point, this sense of abandonment, the sense that precisely those people who are supposed to be the advocates of human rights, of social justice, of equality, of the right to self-determination, have entirely abandoned that when it comes to the Jews. And I think in that sense, by the way, I think we're in an 1880s moment also in the sense that we need the kind of new thinking that was manifested by Chibat Zion in the 1880s. We need to, it'll be different, of course, in the 2020s, but we need new thinking that is based on the really almost miraculous success of this inconceivable and improbable Zionist progress as our starting point. Zionist project, I meant to say. Okay, so yes, I accept your qualification, David, and I didn't mean to overstate the case. Okay, what forces are at work in the quickening? Okay, I must have been in the middle of something talking about what, I don't know if you mean here, Marla, the quickening of Palestinian nationalism or the quickening of Zionism. Yes, probably if we're talking about Palestinian nationalism, I would pick up Rashid Khalidi's book on Palestinian identity, as well as Yehoshua Porat's works. He has 2 volumes. The exact titles are escaping me at the moment. 2 volumes on Palestinian nationalism. He's one of the earliest, Yehoshua Porat is one of the earliest historians to look at the growth of Palestinian nationalism. Still very valuable books. And Rashid Khalidi, I'll just say one thing about Rashid Khalidi's book, and I'll relate this to what I was saying about the Balfour Declaration. Okay? One of the critiques, the Palestinian critiques of the Balfour Declaration, is that it talks about the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, in other words, recognizing Jewish national rights. And yet it says that nothing shall be done to prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing populations. And many Palestinians or supporters of the Palestinian cause say, well, why does Balfour recognize national rights of the Jews, but only recognizes civil and religious rights of Palestine's Arabs? And I think, I don't think he'd be happy to admit this, quite frankly, but Rashid Khalidi, what he teaches us in his book, Palestinian Nationalism, is that a distinct, separate Palestinian national identity begins to emerge among, initially, as is the case with most nationalisms, among a thin stratum of an intellectual elite in the 1920s. Okay? In the 1920s. So we can't really have expected either the British or the Zionists to see them as a distinct national group in 1917, when no Palestinians thought of themselves in those terms as well. And again, I'm relying here on Rashid Khalidi. He is not exactly a Zionist historian. So I would recommend that. I hope that answers the question. How did the UN determine the boundaries in its 1947 partition plan? That's really an excellent question, which is, of course, the topic for another 17-hour lecture. But in a nutshell, it was based on the centers of Jewish settlement and the centers of Arab settlement at the time, right? In other words, where there tended to be more Jews, that was going to be part of the Jewish state. Where there tended to be more Arabs, that was part of that was designated as part of the Arab state. And of course, the international region was an expression of the global interest in the holy sites of Jerusalem. Okay, let me go on. Jonathan asks, you mentioned the Palestinian Arab uprising began in the 1920s. The uprising, what's known as the Great Arab Revolt, begins in 1936. It's from 1936 to 1939. There are outbursts and beginnings of organizing of Palestinian national organizations in the 20s already. What were the claims they believed they had, and were they considered displaced by the Balfour Mandate or other agreements? Yes, so the claims were really fairly consistent up until the 1948 period. Number one claim was the claim of dispossession, okay? That the Zionist settlement, immigration and settlement to Palestine was dispossessing Palestine's Arabs. the reality is a little bit more complicated. There were all sorts of crises, which I didn't have time to get into, in Arab peasant life and in Arab urban life in Palestine at the time, that date back to the mid-19th century and the Ottoman land reform and the structures of land ownership in Palestine. But in any case, they saw Zionism as posing a threat of displacement. They saw the Jews immigrating, and this is a claim we hear to this day, as foreign invaders. Okay? The Zionists coming to Palestine, of course, saw themselves as returnees, as natives returning home, right? I always like to quote in this regard the 1966 speech by the Israeli author Shai Agnon. In 1966, he won the Nobel Prize for Literature, and he opens his Nobel speech by saying, "By an accident of history by which Titus of Rome destroyed the temple in Jerusalem in the year 70 CE, I was born in one of the cities of exile. But always I saw myself as one who had been born in Jerusalem." This was the widespread Jewish self-perception. Jews saw themselves and were seen by others among whom they lived as belonging over there in that place, Palestine, land of Israel. We see this all over in the debates in the late 18th century, debates about emancipation, right? Just to give you one example. One of the questions is, can we emancipate the Jews when in fact they really belong over there and that's where their loyalty will be, right? And that was seen as self-evident by the supporters and the negators of emancipation. So these were clashing perceptions. For the Arabs in Palestine, this was an invasion of European colonialists. For the Jews, this was a return home, and many of them had this romantic, naive vision that I mentioned in my talk, that they would come and they would remerge with their racial brethren. That was the language of the time, and that didn't quite happen, as we know. How did the Zionist movement and later the Yishuv make sense of why many Jews would still not make Aliyah even after 1948? Yeah, that's a good question, and there were all sorts of differing views on this. Some versions of Zionism saw this really as a deep, I would say, psychic flaw in the Jewish psyche, right? That Jews were, as the Israeli author Aleph Bet Yoshua would say, they can't get rid of their disease of wanting to be in exile, in a sense. But others, and this dates back to Achad Ha'am, really thought they didn't think it was ever realistic for all Jews to make Aliyah and live in Israel, but they thought that Israel should be the center, or at the very least, in some of the even more moderate versions, a center of Jewish life. Okay, so that could take different forms in different currents of Zionism. Were the first settlements established in 1967? So I think here, obviously, you mean by settlements the post-1967, what we today call settlements, those in the occupied territories. Not quite in 67, but the real thrust towards settlement begins in the 1970s with the rise of a group known as Gush Emunim, the Bloc of the Faithful. This is a religious Zionist group which understands 1967 in messianic terms and believes that the resettlement of what are, after all, the historic lands that Jews had been longing for. Jews hadn't been praying for Tel Aviv, which didn't exist for centuries. Jews had been praying for Jerusalem and Hebron and the lands that, in fact, are in what we consider today Palestinian territories. And so Gush Emunim was really the major thrust, although there were, even in the Israeli Labor Party, for security reasons, there were some settlement initiatives. The major momentum comes after 1977, when the Labor Party, which had ruled Israel since 1948, is voted out of power. The more right-wing Likud party comes to power and really now creates government incentives to increase and enhance settlement in those territories. Okay, let me move on here. Why did Arafat and Abbas walk away from 2000 and 2008 negotiations for a two-state solution? That's an excellent question. Of course, different scholars have vastly divergent answers to this. I'll give you mine. I think that they simply could not ultimately accept a two-state solution. The existence of Israel is such an abomination from their perspective that they simply cannot accept it. And I think this, this is one of the things that I think we all need to recognize. And let me, in fact, let me make a somewhat personal note here and be less of a historian and simply a citizen of Israel for the moment, and say, I have always belonged politically to what in Israel is roughly known as the left, or the peace camp, and I believe Israel should strive for peace in every way possible. That being said, I think we can only strive for peace based on recognition of reality. And I have to say that as a historian, and I've studied the origins of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, one of the things that, and I mentioned this in response to one of the other questions, Palestinian discourse, Palestinian national discourse, since the 1920s, sees no legitimate place for any kind of state of Israel. There are very few voices that differ from this. And so this is a challenge that we need to live with. We still need to strive for peace, but we need to recognize that, that Abbas and Arafat, as you mentioned in your question, simply can't make that step that says, okay, we can accept even a smaller version of the state of Israel alongside a smaller version, smaller than what we would have liked, of a Palestinian state. That simply flies against their most fundamental principles in the end. What is the latest research on the Palestinian refugee situation arising out of the 1948 war? What percentage of Arabs left voluntarily to get out of war zones versus military expulsions? That's an excellent question. Obviously, one of the most contentious topics in the study of the conflict, certainly the study of the 1948 war. Let me say this, what is uncontroversial, what we know to be a fact, is that somewhere between 700,000 and 750,000 of Palestine's Arabs became refugees after the 1948 war. The classical narratives, right, the Palestinian narrative used to speak about expulsion and massacre at the hands of the Israelis. The Israeli narrative used to speak of reaching out our hand in peace and the Arab leaders telling the Arabs to leave temporarily so they could throw the Jews into the sea. Benny Morris's book, The Birth of the Refugee, the Palestinian Refugee Problem, argued back in the 1980s, in perhaps his most famous sentence, he says, the Palestinian refugee problem was the product of war, not of design. In other words, it was the actual war, the ongoings of the, he argues against the notion that there was some kind of Zionist effort at ethnic cleansing. I think those claims hold no water, by the way, at all. But he also suggests that the notion that people left voluntarily is at best partially true. The reality was there was a war. People leave during wars when bullets are flying and missiles are dropping near them. And he describes the process, right? First, the elites left, the doctors, those who could, those who had a vacation home in Damascus or in Beirut, thinking they would probably return. And then Palestinian society began to collapse because they had no doctors, they had no bankers, they had no teachers. And so increasingly people left, and then the realities of war, which are brutal realities, further led. And there were documented cases in which Arab leaders said, okay, get out temporarily, we'll throw the Jews into the sea, and then you can come back. So it's a mix of various stories there. Okay, I hope I'm giving sufficient answers. Ideally, this would be a give and take, but kind of hard to do on a webinar. Hasn't Israeli politics aggravated the original concepts of Zionism rather than going back to original intent? Thank you for that question, Dory. and here I cannot resist becoming just an Israeli citizen again rather than a historian, but admittedly an Israeli citizen who has studied Zionism a fair amount. Absolutely. Look, I've spent the last 10 months out on the streets protesting against this government. This government, current government, in my view, is not only anti-democratic, it is an anti-Zionist government. It is undoing the achievements of Zionism and doing that by design. So, Dori, yes, I agree with you. Our tragedy is that even in this grave, grave crisis that we're in, and it is a grave crisis. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the feeling in Israel today. We are living here feeling like we're in at least something that verges on an existential crisis. Okay? And we are being led by an incompetent and anti-Zionist government that exacerbates our problem at the moment. So forgive me for waxing political, but you asked the question. When did the word Palestine actually first begin to be used? The word Palestine is a word essentially invented by the Romans with first the destruction of the Second Temple in the year 70 CE, and then when they get really annoyed with the Jews after the Bar Kokhba revolt, 135 CE, they want to eliminate any Jewish sense of connection to the land, so they forbid a Jewish presence in Jerusalem, which they rename Elia Capitolina, and they rename the land of Judea, which is what it was called up until that point. That's where the word Jews comes from. Okay? They are Jews, are people who come from Judea. They changed the name of the land to Palestine based on the biblical people of Plishtim, Philistines, who were, they lived on the coastal plain, roughly in the Gaza Strip area in biblical times, and the Romans take the name of this people and apply it to the land as a whole. Okay? So that's when it begins to be used. I should add, by the way, the official name of this land in Hebrew up until 1948, during the Mandate period, was Palestina Eretz Israel, Palestine, land of Israel. That's the official name in Hebrew. So when we talk about Palestine up until May 14th of 1948, that's simply what this place was called then. Okay. What was the motivation of the British to facilitate the immigration of Jews to Palestine in the early 20th century? Were they concerned about immigration to Britain? Okay, wonderful question. I'll try and answer this quickly. First of all, under the Mandate, the British did not really encourage or facilitate immigration of Jews, certainly not after the, what's known, as I mentioned this in the talk, what's known as the Churchill White Paper, which not only limited now the Palestine Mandate only to Western Palestine, it also established what was known as the principle of economic absorptive capacity. Only such number of Jews could immigrate to Palestine as Palestine was able to absorb economically. Okay, as the economy of Palestine would permit. You can imagine that this became a major point of friction between Zionists and the British in interpreting what the economic absorptive capacity was, right? The Zionists argued repeatedly that, in fact, increased immigration of Jews to Palestine would expand the economy of Palestine, and therefore increase the economic absorptive capacity. As it turns out, history shows that, in fact, the Zionists were correct in this, but the British often actually had an interest in using the notion of economic absorptive capacity to limit Jewish immigration. Earlier on, however, in the early 20th century, before the First World War and before the British Mandate, British interest in Zionism, and in fact even an offer of land to the Zionists in East Africa in 1903, but that's a whole separate story, then one of the motivations is precisely as you suggest, is a concern with Eastern European Jewish immigration into England and the establishment of the Jewish ghetto of the East End of London, for example, which this was a phenomenon we're familiar with from many places throughout the world in the early 20th century, including Buenos Aires, New York City, where these sort of Jewish ghettos were established, and neither Jews nor local authorities were always terribly thrilled with this. So yes, that was sometimes a motivation.
Okay, Arieh, I think we'll take two more questions and then we'll wrap it up.
Good, fair enough. All All right, I'm just going to go in the order in which they're here, so forgive me if I end up skipping over your question. Would you review your closing point about the basis of the conflict between Israel and Palestine? You went over it quickly and I missed it. Yes, I know. I really didn't leave sufficient time for that, so I apologize. In a nutshell, and of course, this is another, at the very least, semester-long course, the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. In a nutshell, what I would say is the following. It is not at root, and this is why it's so hard to solve, it is not at root a conflict over real estate, a conflict over territory. It is at root something that runs much deeper. It goes to identities, to senses of belongingness, to senses of justice and injustice, and to religious beliefs. In the end, religious, and religious here, I mean religious, with a small r, broadly writ, including all sorts of versions of religiosities that we might not always label as religions in a more institutional sense. And so it's really a very difficult problem to solve. One of the reasons, among the various efforts to reach some kind of resolution, in the Oslo process, for example, one of the notions was to leave Jerusalem for the end, okay? Because Jerusalem is so difficult to deal with. But I think that was in fact, and I understand that motivation, by the way, because I don't know how one solves the problem of Jerusalem, but in a certain sense, that was also Oslo's undoing, because Jerusalem is the core. It's sort of like, you can't solve the core of a problem without addressing the core. It's a Band-Aid otherwise. And so the core really goes to, I think, these senses of belongingness, the sense of connection to place and one's place in the world. And it's really that deep, this conflict, I think. I'm sorry if that's sort of a pessimistic perspective, but that's the reality. All right, last question. Interesting how Christian restorationism played a role early on and continues to play such a large role in U.S. foreign policy today. Yes, and that, in a sense, that goes to my last comment. We also have this thing, we have this notion, all historians know, and many people who've read about 19th century Palestine know that there was tremendous religious ferment in the Holy Land in the 19th century. Okay? Anybody who's been to Jerusalem and sees the churches and missionary outposts that are built outside the walls of the old city, okay? Those are all 19th century constructions. The 19th century was a period of tremendous competition and ferment over not the geopolitical Palestine, that as well, but also over the Holy Land with all of its theological implications. And we somehow have this picture, in the common historical picture that we have, that there's the 19th century with this religious ferment, and then along comes the 20th century and the First World War and the Balfour Declaration, British mandate, and now this religious ferment is sort of irrelevant, and what we have is a national conflict between Jews and Arabs. And yes, we do have the advent of that national conflict between Jews and Arabs, but the Holy Land is still reverberating throughout the world and within the conflict between Jews and Arabs. And let me just give you one example of this. And I can end with this, is, I mentioned the 1929 riots as considered to be, the quickening point of Palestinian Arab nationalism and of the conflict, right? Hillel Cohen's book on the 1929 riots calls it the 0 hour, right? This is the moment when the conflict begins, okay? What almost no historians have noticed is that in the lead up to the 1929 riots, which again, I mentioned this earlier, let me stress it. They begin at the Temple Mount Western Wall. That is not an accident, okay? That these two national movements are confronting one another at this religious holy site, and this remains the case today. What few historians have noticed is that during 1928, 1929, in the lead up to those riots, if we open up the newspapers of Palestine at the time, we will discover conflicts between the Latin Patriarchate and the Greek Orthodox Church over rights at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, of the Church of the Nativity, conflict between the Ethiopian Church and the Armenian Church over this. Up until this moment of outbreak between Jews and Arabs, Jews and Muslims, there is boiling over conflict between other religious groups over rights at various sites in the Holy Land. It's not an accident that both the Peel Commission and the UN partition proposal, 1937, 1947, leave the holy sites around Jerusalem extraterritorialized, internationalized, because they're still grappling for them, right? So yes, Christian restorationism, Christian supersessionism or replacement theology still play roles here. And Muslim and Jewish beliefs play roles here. And I would add as a final component there, the secularized versions of various themes taken from those religious traditions also play tremendously important roles here. And we need to remember that that kind of secularization is in itself redolent with religious overtones. I guess I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Professor Saposnik. This was excellent, brilliant in all respects and informative. And I'm sure that everybody who attended the program has learned a lot. I do want to mention all our attendees that although we have been focusing on what's going on in Israel and in Gaza, we have prepared for the year a lot of other programs. And this coming week, and the week after, we have a wonderful presentation, which is a combination of a lecture and a recital dealing with music in the Holocaust era. And it's the person who is going to do it for us is Adam Milstein, a wonderful violinist from Los Angeles. And I highly recommend that you register for it. There is a connection, of course, between the Holocaust and what's going on in Israel right now. And we're going to look at some of the more beautiful aspects of it, and that's the artistic creativity. So again, thank you, Arieh, for a terrific talk. And I wish you all a good day, a good evening, wherever you are, and stay connected to Jewish studies. Thank you.
Thank you.